Hello, and welcome to my Borderpolar podcast. My name is Lynette, and this podcast is basically a way for me to take information that I have learned about what it means to be borderpolar and share it with other people if they're interested in listening. What is borderpolar? Let's start with that. Borderpolar is a non-diagnostic term, meaning that psychiatrists aren't going to use this term, but it's meant to designate someone who has a diagnosis of both borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. So the border from borderline and the polar from bipolar. So borderpolar. I first saw this term when I was looking up what it means to have both of these two disorders together. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder back in 2005, but not with borderline personality disorder until 2018. So when I first started looking into what does it mean to have both of them, I didn't find a lot of resources, but I did see a paper and I did see the term borderpolar, and I've liked that term to describe myself, I suppose. But about 10 months ago, I found myself in a place where I felt safer than I'd ever felt before. And I was able to finally sort of start learning about what my BPD or borderline personality diagnosis meant to me. And at that time, I joined a couple Facebook groups, support groups for people who had bipolar disorder and support groups for people with borderline personality disorder. But I had trouble finding any groups for people with both disorders together at first. And so what I did was I decided to create one. And so I created a Facebook group called My Borderpolar Podcast, with the intention of then creating a YouTube channel called My Borderpolar Podcast, where I would take information that I've found through my own research and reading in order to understand my own diagnosis better, and in order to learn how to cope with my own diagnosis better, and in order to learn how to understand my own emotions better, and in order to learn how to change my own behavior better. All these things that I've learned, to take them and sort of put them in one place and relay them for other people if they're looking for the same thing I was looking for, information about being borderpolar. And the reason that I decided I wanted to do this is because, well, basically, I'm a teacher. And in that, I mean, I went to school to learn how to teach. I went to school and I got a degree in biology with a concentration on secondary education. And so I was certified to teach students between 6th and 12th grade biology, up to and including advanced placement biology, and also chemistry, not including advanced placement chemistry. And so being a teacher at heart, and having been a student for so long, because I didn't complete my degree until I was 35 years old, teaching for me has always been the very best way to learn. I was going to school and I had children when I was going to school. So I did a lot of reading of my notes out loud and then listening back to my notes on the way to work in order to learn. And so I know, and I've learned a lot about different types of learners who learn by listening, who learn by reading, who learn by writing, who learn by doing. And I thought, if I can read and research everything I would like to know about this disorder, and I don't know if I'll ever hit that limit because I will never be finished recovering and improving on myself. But if I can read and research everything that I would like to know and then put it in one place for anyone else who would like to know so that they have a centralized location to go to, that would be great. And if no one, if people don't join in with me on this, that's okay, because it's still my journey to learning and recovery. But if anyone does, then yay, because helping people, that's great. And if not, if you watch this and you don't come back, great, thanks for stopping by, no problem. But I just wanted to I figured if I can use my passions, my passion for life science, biology, my passion for understanding my own self in order to grow, and my passion for teaching and learning, and put them all towards something that it can't be bad. So here I am, My Borderpolar Podcast. Thank you for joining me. This is my introduction video. My first actual video in my first 6-part video series is going to be called What is Borderpolar? And it's the first in a series called A Borderpolar Diagnosis. And basically, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the term borderpolar, why I think it's important, an important distinction in psychology, what borderpolar looks like, which means basically what does bipolar look like, and what does borderline personality look like. When I say look like, I mean, what are the symptoms? And when I talk about the symptoms, I'm talking about as they're described in the DSM-5. And the DSM-5, if you're not aware, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it is the book that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental health disorders here in the United States. So if you're talking about, do I have bipolar disorder? Do I have borderline personality disorder? What you're actually saying is, do I exhibit the symptoms that qualify me to be considered as having this disorder? Think about symptoms as like paint colors on a paint palette. You know, you have shades and shades and shades and shades of red, but they're all red. And each of those different tiny differences of red, all those different reds are symptoms. And if you have a certain symptoms on that big spectrum, if you have these 5 symptoms or these 6 symptoms or these 7 symptoms, then you have one disorder. If you have these other symptoms, you have another disorder. And so a lot of them are going to overlap. But basically that's how it works with the DSM. And for example, for borderline personality disorder, you have to have not 5 out of a specific 9 symptoms. And then for, sorry, my speech gets stuck sometimes. And for bipolar disorder, you have to have, to be considered having a depressive a major depressive episode, you have to have at least 5 of these 9 depressive symptoms. And to be considered as having a manic episode, then you have to have at least 3, I believe. Yes, 3 or more of the 7 manic symptoms. And so there's a lot of flavors basically to these 2 disorders. And these are the things that I'm going to cover in the next video that I have called What is Borderpolar? I'm going to talk about what is bipolar, what is borderline personality disorder very briefly, and then later on in the video series I'll discuss those more in depth. Briefly, in this first video, I will be discussing what is borderpolar, a little bit about treatment, a little bit about types of therapy, a little bit about getting a diagnosis in general and mental health, and basically that's what I'm going to talk about in the first video. The second video is going to be called Understanding Borderpolar, and I'm going to go into more in depth in that video into what the symptoms of borderpolar and bipolar and borderline personality disorder mean in terms of what they look like in translation into someone's life. Yes, the symptoms talk about what the person is feeling or maybe some patterns, but what that means for how it could present itself in one's life can be very different from person to person. So just some examples of that, examples from my own life and some examples from other cases that I could point you to. I'm going to include references at the end of each of my other videos to let you know where you can find this information on your own. And then the next one's going to be called What Loved Ones Need to Know. So that's going to be a video about how to approach the subject with parents, siblings, children, that sort of thing. Navigating Your Brain will be episode 4. That's going to be a lot of biology, physiology, some specific stuff about how the brain's going to work differently in someone with bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder than it would someone who does not have either of these disorders. So it's going to be the concrete scientific evidence that they have showing the differences in the brain, as well as the genetic components of the 2 disorders. What's next? Treatment and recovery will be episode 5, where we'll talk more about medication and more about treatment and therapy. We're just going to touch on it a little bit in the first video. And then episode 6 is going to be once we've talked a little bit more about borderpolar, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about my own borderpolar journey. Because the question you have to be thinking if you're going to watch my videos is, why would I be interested in hearing what she has to say? And the first answer I have for you is, I don't know. The second answer I have for you is, well, I've been through quite a lot, and I'm sure you have too. And it's always easier to listen to someone if you can understand them a little bit more. So when I get to that 6th video, I'll talk a little bit more about my own borderpolar journey, but just a brief statistical analysis for you There was a 2-year period in my life where I had 33 different jobs. I've lived in 15 different places, 6 in a 3-year period, and some of them were just blocks from each other, but I was restless, and I didn't know that this was symptomatic. And I was married for most of my adult life, but during the period where I was single and undiagnosed fully, well, let's just say that I dated more than my fair share of men. And these acts, the impulsivity, living lots of places, dating a lot of people, going from job to job, the instability, the impulsivity, these are all characteristic of borderline personality disorder, and in some ways characteristic of bipolar disorder. And I just want to make sure that that from one border polar to another, I've been there as far as the symptoms manifesting themselves in your life. I've also been there as far as the recovery goes. So just a little bit about where my recovery is at. And I'm not going to go into this too in depth, but over the last 10 months, in addition to creating my Borderpolar podcast Facebook page, I've been reading through this DBT workbook. I haven't had a chance to actually get DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy, but dialectical behavior therapy is a type of cognitive behavior therapy, a psychotherapy that is recommended for people with borderline personality disorder. It's also recommended for people with eating disorders, and it's also recommended for people with addictions. So I've been reading through that on my own, even though DBT is generally meant to be done in a group environment. It's meant to be done, so you know, supervised by a therapist who's trained in it, as well as with the guidance of your own therapist outside of the program at least once a week. So if you're working through a DBT program, these are the things you should have. But I have been working on that on my own, and I am going to release some videos sort of going over the book for anyone who isn't able to get DBT and might be interested. But again, this is really about the best way for me to learn and discover and my own growth. And if you decide to join me on the journey, wonderful. Another thing I've been working on over the last several months is creating my own little self-help travel book just for myself. On this first page, I have arrest strategies for what to do if I'm in crisis on the go. The second page is some self-coping thoughts, and then just some empowering, just different things to think about if you're out and about and you need a moment to sort of take a breath, calm down, chill out, whatever it is that you need to do. And I've been sharing these as well on my Facebook page for anybody who might be interested in that type of coping, but I'm interested in all types of coping. So I've been involved in a mindfulness course since the middle of January that goes until March, and I've been learning a lot there and sharing a little bit of what I've been learning on my Facebook page. But to be honest, I'm mostly taking a lot of it in right now and planning on implementing it a little bit later when I have more time. But after the Borderpolar diagnosis 6-series video, I'll have a 6-video series called The Borderpolar Parent, where I'm going to discuss what it's like parenting as a borderpolar. The 6 videos in that, very briefly, are going to be called What and When to Tell the Kids, What to Expect When You're Exploding, How to Forgive Yourself, How to Apologize for Your Actions, What I Wish I Would Have Known, and Value-Based Parenting. So as you can sort of get an idea of what the podcast is going to be about, mostly it's going to be information. I'll have cited my sources at the end of all my videos, which are going to be PowerPoint with a video within it. And if you decide that you're interested in, if you have a dual diagnosis of borderpolar and you want to be a part of my Facebook community, then that's also my Borderpolar podcast on Facebook. I would ask that you're only a part of that community if you do have the dual diagnosis, because I want people to feel free to express themselves in there as mental health patients. But that this video series on here is available for anyone and everyone who wants information about borderpolar, borderline, bipolar, treatment, recovery, mindfulness, or what have you. So again, thank you. Welcome to my Borderpolar podcast. Simply put, this is, well, it's my Borderpolar podcast.